My birth on January 20th, 1856, was followed shortly by a letter from my mother, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to her cousin, Elizabeth Smith Miller, informing her that after the terrible ordeal she was in the land of the living, rejoicing a daughter's birth, and that no boy was sent in her stead. Others were less enthusiastic. A cousin's memories of my 5 brothers were positive. They were, in his words, healthy, hearty kids who had little restraint put upon them. But he found Maggie and me distasteful. Aunt Lib, he declared, taught her daughters that they were the chosen few, and so must regulate the affairs of the universe. The greatest restraints in my life came from my conservative aunts in Johnstown, New York, where Maggie and I spent our summers, and from the inevitable visits of the indefatigable Susan B. Anthony. My mother was not beautiful, but her blue eyes danced with life, with sympathy and understanding. She drew you to her service because of her abounding love. Susan's leadership over us youngsters had a different source. We were a bit afraid of her. Susan B. Anthony was just one of many of the great reformers who surrounded us in our childhood. When one's youth is informed by such illustrious figures as Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, one can hardly expect any tolerance for mediocrity. I developed a habit of walking out of any school I found did not reach my standard of faultless commitment to equality of rights. Childhood behind me, I set my sights on Cornell University, but Aunt Harriet, who funded my education, had different ideas. I graduated from Vassar, where I found a mentor in my astronomy professor, Maria Mitchell. Seeking to find my vocation after graduation, I traveled to Europe and met Harriot Blatch of Basingstoke, England. I lost my American citizenship, but not my loyalty to the country of my birth. In the 20 years I lived in England, I never considered myself a subject of Her Majesty, but surrounded myself instead with the most radical thinkers of her realm, including Fabian socialists and militant suffragists like my friend, Emmeline Pankhurst. Like them, I rejected ladylike reforms. Woman not tough, why half her indiscretions would kill off a whole generation of men. After 1896, Nora and I split our time between Harry and Basingstoke and my mother in New York City. Nora adored her grandmother, who, despite advanced age, was still a towering intellectual figure, as well as a doting grandmother. She was sovereign of our family and queen mother to her grandchildren. I inherited Mother's cause after her death, but felt no less committed to the rights of working women. 60 years after my mother launched the movement in Seneca Falls, NAWSA's leadership saw fit to criticize my unconventional suffrage tactics. I reminded them that in 1848, Mrs. Mott shared similar concerns with my mother. Why, Lizzie, thee will make us ridiculous. But Mother wasn't afraid. The women of Seneca Falls were not afraid of ridicule. Nay, they courted ridicule, for ridicule would spread the knowledge of the truth. Ridicule, 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 blessed be ridicule. I rejected polite parlor meetings for open-air street meetings. Instead of yearly conventions attended by the already converted, I planned spectacular parades. The enemy must see women marching in increasing numbers year by year out on public avenues, holding high their banner, Votes for Women. Look at our 1912 suffrage parade. For 2.5 hours, we marched, white and black women, mothers and daughters, blue bloods, college graduates, and factory girls. A special delegation of Chinese American women marched to celebrate women's progress in China and to demand their rights in America. Anti-suffragists claimed it was an impertinence, a public display of sex appeal. I just laughed. Funny idea of sex appeal. 20,000 women turn out on a hot day, thermometer registered 87 degrees, and march up Fifth Avenue to the blaring music of 35 bands, eyes straight to the front, faces red with the hot sun, if it had been mellow moonlight. But sex appeal set to brass bands, that certainly is a new one. Not everyone liked my guerrilla methods, but I never saw the need to march in lockstep. Mrs. Catt believed otherwise and demanded a unified front and a singular dedication to the vote, disparaging what she considered extraneous attention to other issues. Mrs. Cat can have her opinions. What bothers me is that she also seems to want to take all the credit too. When we didn't carry New York in 1915, we turned again to the national stage and headed west, where women of several states already had the vote. Everywhere I went, women would come up to me to shake the hand of the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Even before suffrage was finally won, I was ready to move on. My mother was a many-ideaed woman who alienated those suffragists more concerned with reinforcing their privilege than in demanding true equality. Whereas such women took themselves as the noble benefactors of the working woman, I saw that it was the working woman who must lead the way into the future. We must have fair conditions and equal pay for equal work in all fields and professions, as well as compensation for the work women perform in the home. Like my mother before me, I grew more confident and more radical with age. And like my mother before me, that came with a price. Even as my socialism marginalized me, many began to say that it was Susan B. Anthony and not the more radical and troublesome Elizabeth Cady Stanton who began it all in Seneca Falls. This infuriated my brother Theodore, who complained that Susan B. Anthony had as much to do with the 1848 convention as the man in the moon. My mother would not conceive of suffrage as standing by itself as an issue unrelated to other issues. For her, it was inseparable from the anti-slavery agitation, from women's demand for entry into the field of labor, into the universities and professions. Later, when she saw how narrow the American suffrage movement had become, she was much disturbed and said in a solemn warning, "If the American suffrage movement does not develop broader interests, why then, when women get the right to vote, they will be totally unprepared for the part they ought to play in American political life." She was right, of course. Mother always was. I hope I have been a worthy daughter to such a great woman, and that I have not just carried her message faithfully, but also carried it forward. If younger women could only realize how difficult it was to win what rights we have today, they would be less indifferent. I am convinced that women are facing a crisis today and must unite and take a definite stand to protect the rights they have won, and in saving these rights, they will also save civilization. The world is calling for women of vision and courage. May the women of the world hear the call and go forward.